Okay, let's get going. So I thank you all again for attending these webinars, and please, if you have suggestions for other topics you would like us to cover, please send them to me, and I'll be happy to do additional webinars where there's interest and where it can be helpful. The issue we're talking about today is premarital money assist, and actually there's two problems that we're talking about. It's the premarital money problem and the offsetting accounts problem. And they both raised similar questions and similar issues. In a nutshell, the things that we're going to focus on today is giving you the tools to do two things, which are common tools you're going to want to use to solve those problems in ways that are advantageous to your clients. The first one is figuring out how to determine what an account balance was in a defined contribution plan on a given date. And the second is figuring out how to determine how that account has performed in terms of investment performance between two dates. And those are the basic tools that we're going to be describing to you, showing you how to get those, do those things. And it's in the context of solving the two problems, which I describe as the premarital money problem and the offsetting accounts or combining awards problems. So why is it that we care about trying to solve these problems? The first, most important reason is because there are opportunities here to get your client the best deal possible. And I think a lot of times people overlook it. And I don't want to suggest that you always have to get into fighting over the issues that we're going to be talking about today, because sometimes you'll take a look at it and you'll say it's just not worth it, or the amount at stake is not significant. But there are times where there is a lot of money, there could be a potential lot of money at stake, and you should be aware of the scope of what that is, so you can decide whether you want to spend resources haggling over it, fighting over it, etc. And so you can be deliberate about not paying attention to it if that's what you're doing. The second reason is because, obviously, maybe not a concern for all of you, but it's a concern to me, is that it'll make my life a whole lot easier if the more information all of you have about how to solve these problems. You'll be able to get these cases to me further along the line, and that makes my life easier, because these issues that are raised by premarital money and how to calculate earnings and determine offsets from one account against another at different dates are some of the biggest headaches that I experience. And so I have a selfish reason why I want you to do more with these tools. But the primary reason is because it really will help your clients. And in doing that, if you send me something where I have to start asking questions to try and solve these problems, the risk is that in my solving the problem, a knock-on is that maybe it makes you look bad. And it will obviously never be my intention to make one of the lawyers that I work with look bad, but it can raise questions in the minds of your clients. If I'm asking a question, well, why didn't my lawyer ever deal with this question? And so the objective here is to make you all better at dealing with these questions and getting better deals for your clients. So let's talk for a second about the premarital money problems. The issue here is that if a participant on the day they get married has some money in their account, that's premarital asset. And when it comes to the divorce later on and we're dividing up the account, we need to figure out how much that premarital money is worth on the day that we're dividing the account up. And so in order to factor in what that premarital money is worth on the day that we're making the division, we need to know two things. First, we need to know how much money was in the account on the day that they got married. So we need to know the account balance on the date of marriage. And then we need to add earnings to that account from the date of marriage up through the date that we're doing the division, which is usually the date of service. And my presentation here refers to it as the date of service. But it could be a different date. It could be a subsequent date after the date of service, depending on what else you're doing. So you need to apply earnings through the date of service and adjust that date of marriage balance forward so that we can say the premarital money on the date we're making the division is X, subtract X from the account balance on the date of the division, and the rest of what's left is the marital portion, and that's what we divide in two. That is the way to do this. I've had some people send orders, decrees that say something along the lines of all the contributions that went in during the marriage are marital, and that's what we're dividing. Well, technically that's true, but that is not how you actually go about doing the division, because trying to take every contribution that went in during a marriage and adjust each one for earnings is, well, it's possible theoretically, but it's not practically possible. So this is the technical way you solve that problem, by adjusting the premarital money and taking it out, rather than actually calculating what the marital portion is. One of the problems that's presented with solving this premarital problem is that in determining what the account balance is on the day of marriage, it can be quite difficult because those are obviously dates that are a long time ago. And so finding out what that balance is not always easy. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ways and some of the places you can go to find that information in a minute. The other problem is that the plan won't calculate earnings from the date of marriage to whatever the division date we're doing. Plans are not going to do that for you. And so we have to do it ourselves, which means that as a practical matter, what that means is that in almost every case, we're doing something to try and estimate what the earnings are. We cannot, as a practical matter, except in extremely rare case, can we actually calculate what the actual earnings were on the premarital money. The reason for that is because, let's say you have an account statement that tells you how an account was invested on the date of marriage, and it's in one or two funds. Now, if that money stayed in those two funds and was never moved throughout the marriage, it's very simple for us to determine the earnings on it. The information is available on the internet, and I'll show you some places to find that information in a minute. And we can calculate the earnings, and we can be very precise. We can be confident that that is awfully close to correct because we know what the investment performance was. But that doesn't happen in real life, except for possibly 1 in 1,000 type of cases. And so we'll talk a little bit later about some of the ways to solve the problems that we don't know how the money was in fact invested. But what I want to illustrate here is just how it works once we've done those calculations, once we know what the account balance was on the two dates, and once we know the earnings to apply. So for example, let's assume a date of marriage in January 3rd of 2005 and a date of service of January 31 of 2018. And let's assume that the account balance on the date of marriage was $10,000, and that we've determined in one of the ways that I'll show you later that the earnings on that $10,000 from January 3, 2005 to January 31, 2018 was 300%. So it's 30,000. So that 10,000 became 40,000 between the date of marriage and the date of service. And then let's assume that the total account balance on the date of service is $100,000. Figuring out the marital portion is pretty straightforward. It's 40,000. You take the premarital portion, which is 10,000 plus 30,000, and that's 40,000. And you subtract that from 100,000, which leaves 60,000, and you divide the 60,000 in two, and each party gets 30,000, and you make that award as of January 31, 2018, the date you're doing the division as of. And the plan will then calculate earnings on that 30,000 from January 31, 2018 going forward. So another time these tools will become significant is the other problem, which is when you're trying to offset two accounts against each other, or you're combining awards together and making the award out of one plan. So this can happen when each party has an account balance. Both parties have an account balance with a marital portion. One of them is bigger than the other, and you want to offset the award in one against the other so you can just move money one time. For example, let's say wife has $400,000 marital assets and husband has $200,000 in marital assets in one of their plans. So the total marital in those two plans is $600,000. You're going to want each party to get $300,000 as of the date of service. So the simple way to do that is to say, let's just take $100,000 out of wife's account and give it to husband as of the date of service. And that's a pretty frequent way to do it. It's simple. Issue there that presents an opportunity and a risk, which I want everybody to be aware of, is what if the wife's account in the example that we're using here, the bigger account, had a 1% return. It's invested in a money market fund, say. And the husband's account was invested in the stock market over the last year and had 20+% return. In a circumstance like that, the wife might prefer to give the husband $200,000 out of her account, which had low earnings, and take $100,000 from the husband's account, which had high earnings. And that would be perfectly legitimate to do. She's entitled to those earnings just like he is because it was a marital asset. And so if you're representing wife in that case, you may well say, no, we're going to take half of each account. If you're representing husband, you might want to try and take and take your $100,000 simply from her account, so that you can keep more of your account. The same issue could arise if you're offsetting a qualified plan asset against other assets or liabilities. So you've got some kind of an equalization payment which is coming out of the qualified plan. Let's say you've got the value of a car, and you're offsetting that against the value of a retirement plan on the date of service. Well, from date of service to the date we're doing this, to the date you're actually going to get the money, that money in the retirement plan may have gone up or down depending on what has happened to the market in the meantime. So maybe you want to take that, offset it at some point in the past. Maybe you don't. Maybe you would rather adjust it in some other way. So you just need to be aware of the issues there that arise when you're taking either more or less than half of a particular account balance on the date of service, because the earnings can impact what you ultimately land up with. It could also arise, and this is a pretty common one, where you have two awards, and this is something that is a perennial issue for me to deal with. Decree says give, even if it goes so far as to say give, say, $80,000 to alternate payee as of the date of service, which is a date in the past. And then it says there's an attorney's fee award, which is $20,000, so therefore add that to the award that's made out of the retirement plan. Well, when is an attorney's fee award valued? Presumably when it's paid or when it's made. When it's made is, and then maybe it's adjusted for, if it's a judgment, it's adjusted for post-judgment interest. But the point is, it's not made generally, unless it's explicitly made, it's not made as of the date of service. And so it may be, if you can combine those two and make the award as of date of service, maybe one side comes off ahead if the plan went up or down, either way, depending on which side you're on, or one side lands up behind. And so to combine those two awards, we almost always will say, well, let's just do two orders, one that implements the date of service division and one that implements the attorney's fee award, or the other award that's not done as of the date of service. Or alternatively, you can say, let's take one of these amounts and bring it back, either bring the attorney's fee award back to the date of service, so it would be probably a reduced amount in a rising market, or bring that date of service amount forward and combine the two. There are issues there with how we're calculating the earnings that you need to be aware of. So let's talk a little bit about where you can get these accurate account statements as of the date of marriage. And it would be the same principles would apply if you're trying to get an account statement as of any date, obviously, but also the date of service. So the single most likely place, which I think a lot of times people aren't even aware of it, is if you have a participant, whether they're your client or the opposing party, almost certainly they have access to their account online. And if they tell you they don't have access to their account online, be very, very suspicious of that, because it's a matter of going to your employer and saying, hey, give me the login information to get my access online. Practically every retirement plan record keeper gives online access to their participants, and your participant can almost certainly go online, look in their account, look in their online access, and find out what their account balance was on some date in the past. Now, issue with that, let's say we've got a plan that's been, people have been married for, say, 30 years, and the plan has moved their assets from one record keeper to another. It may not be possible for your participant to go online and find out what their account balance was 30 years ago, because 30 years ago it was with Schwab, and now it's with Vanguard, and Vanguard won't keep records that tell participants what their account balance was when the record was with Vanguard. So it's possible that they can't go back all the way back to the date the date of the marriage. Another option is sometimes participants actually keep their monthly statements, and so look in your financial records. Maybe they kept financial statements going, statements from their retirement plan going all the way back to the date of marriage. Another place which is often overlooked is the employer might have copies. When those statements go out to participants, the employer gets a copy of them. So the employer may well have in their file somewhere a copy of every participant statement that ever was sent out, even with prior record keepers and 30 years ago. They may well have that statement in their files, so you can have your participant talk to their benefits department, and they may well be able to pull that out for them and a statement in the month or the year of the marriage, and that'll get us a long way to finding out what that account balance was. Another place is that the record keeper might have kept copies. Even if the participant didn't, the record keeper might have copies. And then another place that I think most of you are probably not aware of is the plan sponsor, which is the employer, gets a statement every year from the record keeper for their plan that summarizes everything that happened in that plan trust over the year. And that'll show them every transaction that went in, every contribution that went in, every distribution that went out, and it'll show them by participant what their participants' investments were and what their participant account balances were during that plan year. It might just say at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. It might not tell you as the year was going. But the employer may well have old trust statements, because that's the kind of thing that plan sponsors are well advised to keep basically forever. They shouldn't be destroying those things. So that's another place that you can get those balances. And then you will also need to know what the account balance was on the date of service or the date that you make the division. And that's for regardless of how you're doing this. And those account balances obviously are much easier to get because they're more recent, and they're far more likely to be something that the participant can just get by going online and pulling up a recent account statement. So that's some advice about where to look to get these account balances. Then, so once you've got an account balance or a statement, now we need to figure out how we're going to adjust those amounts from date of marriage forward through the end of the marital community. And like I said, the plan will not tell you what those earnings were, so you have to calculate it yourself. There's a couple of approaches you can take. If you have an account statement from the date of marriage, you can look at how the funds were invested on that day, and that gives you an idea of what the investment lineup, the investment mix was on the date of marriage. And you could use that to say, let's assume it didn't change, which obviously is false, but we have to make assumptions that are not perfect because that's just the world we live in here. So that's one assumption you can make. Or even if you don't know at all how the money was invested, then you can use some proxies. You can say, well, let's imagine that it was invested in some basket of funds, like an S&P 500 index fund, a Dow Jones Industrial Index fund, maybe a target date retirement fund, which has a mixture of investments between equities and bonds and cash type investments. And there you get some. There you can be a little bit creative, depending again on which side of the stick you're pulling on, which circumstance you're in. Do you want the earnings to be high, or do you want the earnings to be low? And then another option, which I want everybody to kind of think about and be aware of, and you might argue for this, is something called the Department of Labor's Voluntary Fiduciary Correction Program online interest calculator. This is a program that the Department of Labor has in place for retirement plans to correct errors when they make a mistake. For example, an employer withholds money from a participant's pay to put into the plan, but for whatever reason they screw it up and they forget, they just don't put it in. And it could be days, it could be months, it could be years later that the error is identified, and the Department of Labor says that money should have gone into the plan back on some date in the past. It's going in now. Here's how we will allow, one of the ways we will allow you to calculate earnings on that lost money. They've got a couple of ways. One is calculate the actual earnings on money that was actually in the plan and determine what that is and adjust the amount for that. Another one is to use their online calculator, which is a blend of federal corporate rates, interest rates. I don't know exactly what the interest rates are. I don't really care because it's fairly complicated and it adjusts every quarter. But the bottom line is that calculator incorporates Department of Labor approved methods for calculating earnings. So the argument goes like this: hey, Department of Labor says this is how somebody has to calculate earnings. This has got the government approval, stamp of approval of the Department of Labor. That gives it some validity. In a world where we don't know what the earnings were, Department of Labor has told us a way to calculate them, and happens to be closely mirror interest rates. So what has interest rates been doing over the last, since 2008? They've been basically, 1%, 2% maybe. What has the stock market done since 2008? It's up, many, many times. So if I want high earnings, I'm not talking Department of Labor. If we're talking about the period from 2008 today, I'm talking about S&P 500, some kind of basket of funds that mirrors the market. If I want low earnings, I'm saying, you don't know what the earnings were. Department of Labor tells us how to do it. Let's use the Department of Labor online interest calculator. So that gives you opportunities to argue one way or the other. So I want to use an example and just show you. Let's say we do know how the plan was invested, and we have ticker symbols of the funds that the plan was invested in. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use a fictitious federal thrift savings account. And one reason I'm doing that is because they're fairly common. Another is because it's got like 5 funds, basic funds in it. And it kind of illustrates the process simply. So here we're going to assume that we have, and I'm going to look here at an actual account statement. You should be seeing the account statement on your screen now. This is an actual account statement which I doctored to make it work for this example. So that's why my scribbly handwriting is all over. But we're assuming that we have an account statement that shows us the account balance on January the 3rd, 2005. And you can see that what tells us there are different funds available in the plan. Life cycle funds, they've got different life cycle funds here. The person had nothing in them, they're worth nothing. They don't come into play here. In this fictitious example, we're assuming the person had 100 shares of the G fund, and the statement tells us the share price on January 3rd, 2005 was $10.69. So that means they had $1,069 in the G fund on January 3rd, 2005. They also had the C fund. They had 100 shares of that at $12.66, which is $1,266. So in this example, this person had $2,335 in their account on their date of service, on the date of marriage. And the statement also shows you a couple of other interesting things. It tells you the percentage of the total account that was invested in each of these funds, so 45.78 and 54.2%. And it also shows you the contribution allocation. That tells you how they were directing new money into the plan at the time. So this participant was, in theory, putting 50% of their money into the G fund and 50% of their new money into the C fund. And they had 45% of the total assets on that day in the G fund and 54% in the C fund. And it shows us the price values. So that might be an account statement that you start with. If you started with that account statement and you didn't, let's say you wanted to say, well, let's assume that it stayed, that the 100 shares in those accounts, in those 2 funds, stayed in those funds from that date up through the date of service. One way to calculate that is, and there's a link to this in the materials, is let's go look at online. We can go to the thrift savings plan. We can ask them to tell us what the historic share prices were of the funds in the plan. And you'll see, so I've pulled this up. I've gone here and I've told it, tell me the start date, January 3rd, 2005. And I'm about to tell it to go to January 31, 2018, which is the date of service. But it started out telling it, just tell me what the funds were on January 4th. And you can see they've got the fund prices here. These are the fund prices that were in that statement. So now I'm going to tell it to show me the fund price. It'll pull up every day between that date and January 31st of 2018, which is the date we're trying to make the division as of. So you can see there's a heck of a lot of information. But basically, if you go all the way to the bottom of this screen, you can see the starting price that we started with. It's probably still pulling up. if you go all the way to the bottom, maybe you just have to trust me on that. You will see that January 3rd, 2005 price. And when you go all the way to the top here, you see the January 31, 2018 price. So here we've got the G fund is 15.572 and the C fund is 39.7632. So you can take those, and now back to determining what that $2,335 was worth on January 31st, 2018. We just take 100 shares, we multiply it by the G fund, multiply it by the price of the G fund on January 31st, 2018. That tells us it's 1,557. We take the C fund, those same 100 shares, and multiply it by the 39.76, and it tells us that's 3,976. Therefore, that premarital money, 2,335, is worth 5,533 on January 31st, 2018. A couple points here just to be aware of. Obviously, the C fund went up a heck of a lot more than the G fund. So if you didn't know how the money was invested, you might say, well, let's just use the C fund if you want it to be high. Or, you know, same issue which I mentioned before. Basically, you get opportunities to be a little bit creative if it's not written in stone how the money was invested, which it almost never is. And so if we take the account balance on the date of service, now we know what we go and find out what the account balance on the date of service on January 31st, 2018 was 31,504. How do I know that? Because I created another fictitious account statement, and it shows on January, here we go. Now the person has a whole lot more shares of G fund and a whole lot more shares of C fund. Those prices are accurate prices, and it shows the total account balance has now gone heavily in favor of the C fund because it had a massive return, and so it adds up to 31,000. It's made up numbers, but it could be something representative of what happens. So the example I'm using here is easy because what you can see. The contribution allocation that this person was using is the same. It's 50% into each fund. So I'm assuming for this example that the person didn't move the money around. But what happens if that second account statement shows that the money hasn't been invested in the same funds and isn't in the same ratio? Well, then you get to be a little bit creative. And I have had situations where it was only slightly different. It was, you know, date of marriage, it was 50-50, and on date of service, it was 60-40. Well, in a case like that, you could just say, well, reasonable assumption would be to say, let's interpolate between the two and say, let's assume it was 55-45 in the two funds between those dates. That's where you have really good data, and it appears like you're making assumptions that come close to mirroring what actually happened in your accounts. Most of the time, we don't get the luxury. That's probably maybe 25% of the time where we get account statements on both days. We can do something like what I've just described, and we can make some assumption that the investments were similar to the investment lineup on 2 days, and we can use actual return on the ticker symbols that are reflected on those statements. But many times, all we'll know perhaps is maybe you get a letter from the plan sponsors, from the plan that says on that given date the account balance was X dollars. And I won't tell you anything about how it was invested on the date of marriage. In a case like that, you need to use something to approximate the earnings on that premarital money. And this is where I think, and I've actually got a spreadsheet that I use in some cases to plug in actual data and to weight the different investments. So we can make an assumption. Let's say you tell me there was 10,000 on the date of marriage. We can say, well, let's assume it was invested 30% in the S&P 500 index, 30% in some target retirement date fund, and 40% in, say, some bond fund. That is actually one of the funds that is offered by this plan today. We can play around with those percentages, but we have to do something on that front. And then we can calculate the the rate of return on those assumed percentages of that premarital money. We can estimate what it's worth on the date of service. And that just involves going online and looking up the ticker symbols. I've put a link here to Yahoo Finance. That's a place where it pulls together a heck of a lot of financial data. You can look at the S&P 500, the Dow, the Nasdaq, the Russell 2000, or you can pull up actual ticker symbols for the different funds that you have. And so we want to try and be as accurate as we can in terms of using something that is most likely something that the account was actually invested in, if we can. Whoops, something just went wrong with my screen now. So we want to use something that is actually reflects what it was invested in the plan, if possible, or just a proxy for that. I apologize, my screen has gone black. So hold on just a second. Okay. Let's take a second to look at the voluntary fiduciary correction program online calculator. This is a tool you all can use, and I would be using these tools before I go to the settlement conference and before I present my position about how to divide up these plans, so that I would know beforehand what's likely to be better for my client, and you know where the pressure points are. You don't have to necessarily tell the opposing party why you want to do it a certain way, because all of the ways I'm describing are defensible and reasonable. So the online calculator requires you to enter a few details. The principal amount would be the date of balance, the balance that was in the account on the date of marriage. That's the starting amount. So let's just say I already entered this using that 2,335, but I'll enter it again. We're going to use that account balance that we just calculated in the thrift savings plan using those actual returns, and we'll put in $2,335. Maybe, there we go. And then you need to put in the last date. The last date is the date that the Department of Labor says, well, when should it have gone into the plan? To use this calculator, we're going to say that's the date of marriage, which was January 3rd. Now, my computer is very slow, and I apologize for that. 2005. And then the recovery date is the date that we're calculating, well, what was the end date for calculating the earnings? And that'll be January 31st. Come on. That's January 31st, 2018. And the final payment date, to make the calculator work, you need to enter the same date, January 31st, 2018. And you can see if you enter that data, what it does is it calculates how much that 2,335 would have accrued in earnings between the two dates that you entered, the lost date and the recovery date. And you'll have to trust me on it. I entered it before, and it calculates $1,889.99 in earnings. So if you take that 2,335 and you add the earnings of 1,889, you get the total amount that premarital money would be worth on January 31st, 2018, if you used the Department of Labor online calculator. And there you go. It just entered it. And that becomes, in this case, using the calculator, the online calculator, we came up with a figure of 4,224 instead of 5,500. So over that period of time, That is literally the difference in the return using the two calculators, the two methods of calculation between 2005 and 2018. So now, if the market were going way down, say we were dealing with a period of time between date of marriage and date of service when the market had gone way down, then you might be flipping your analysis and saying you want to use something that didn't result in losses, which would always be the Department of Labor calculator, will never result in losses. And then, so the last issue we have is how to determine which account your client is best off taking. And so when you're going to offset one account against another, there the issue becomes, let's say we've determined what the marital portion of the two accounts is on the date of service, the date we're going to do this offsetting against each other. In that case, what I would do is sit down and look at how that account was invested on the date of service and do some of this analysis on that account, on the two accounts, and see is there likely to be a significant difference between the rate of return on the two accounts, and is there enough time where it's going to have made it a difference significant enough for you to take more out of one account than the other, or to take just 50-50 out of both of them, or maybe to come up with another proposed solution that doesn't result in your client getting whipsawed, or that does result in your client getting more than they otherwise would get. Being aware of how those things work is I think it's essential for you to be thinking about that, so that you're doing your due diligence representing your clients. Let's just open it up for any questions. If you have a question, you can either type it into the question box, or you can unmute and just shout your question out, and let's talk about any of the issues that this has raised, or if there's anything else you want me to address on this topic.
I just want to thank you for having these little mini seminars.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Erwin, these are super helpful.
Thank you. Well, if there are no questions, we will wrap it up. Obviously, if a question occurs to you later, shoot me. I'm always happy to bounce these issues off of you. To the extent you can get these questions resolved before you settle a case, it's really helpful, because you can see there's issues for discretion here. If you've settled your case and it's all entered, and now I'm raising the question, well, what earnings are we going to use? You can see the possibility for it not working to your client's best advantage necessarily, even though I try and do what's fair. What I think is fair may not be the same thing you think is fair. And you definitely don't want to be having a client say, well, why did you not think of this question beforehand, if you can avoid that. So that's the primary reason to deal with this stuff. Thank you all very much. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a copy of this, this note-taking sheet that has all of the information we talked about, as well as a copy, the recording of the webinar. Thanks.